Hello, my History 289 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins again talking to you about the course. It is week 2. Um, and with week 2, there are some more things that we're going to need to discuss for the week. Your primary readings this week are around primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, around the difference between opinion, fact, and interpretation within the realm of history, but life in general as well, and the readings on everything from oral histories and the evolution of those to the Frederick Jackson Turner and the Turner thesis, and other readings as well. So this video is going to break down, this recording is going to break down into 3 parts around those 3 themes. First, around secondary and tertiary and primary sources. There are distinctions, and it's important to get those right. That primary source, the readings are just going to go over these things, but I want to reiterate it because it's important. I've been teaching history courses for the better part of a quarter of a century, and I've been teaching education courses too. And even graduate students get mixed up around what's a primary source, what's a secondary source, what's a tertiary source, and why does it matter? Well, if you want to record history most accurately and with the most sort of integrity and fairness and everything else, then ultimately you need to be able to do independent research. Research that is not completely dependent on what other people wrote about the same topic. And that's where primary sources come in. The Declaration of Independence in its own time is a primary source. The Magna Carta is a primary source. Artifacts from Mali and Benin and Senegal and Sierra Leone that might date back 1,500, 2,000 years. That's a primary source. If you're doing a history of technology and you find the first single roller, or look at one of the first single rollers from India from roughly around 2,000 years ago, that's not only an artifact, it's a piece of historical evidence, and therefore it's a primary source. Interviewing people, which gets to oral history in a moment, doing oral histories, and interviewing them on direct experience that they've had with a particular issue or topic or event, primary source. A newspaper account that's contemporaneous to an event that takes place is a primary source because it was written in that moment of time, sort of like a snapshot, which also leads to pictures. If a picture was taken of an event, that's a primary source. Those are all examples of primary sources. Secondary sources are sources that are actually recording primary sources. So if you write a book about, say, the Battle of Britain from 1940, or the Blitz, as the British call it, when Nazi Germany bombed London and other cities throughout the UK between roughly September of 1940 and May 10th of 1941, you are in fact, that book is a secondary source because it relies on primary sources. And you, in fact, can use secondary sources and their notes from their primary sources to get at primary sources. You're not completely, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you do research on a particular topic, as long as those sources have done a good job of recording and citing and referencing their primary sources so that you too can verify it. That's the other reason why they have indexes and notes at the end of books, even books that aren't necessarily scholarly books, so that you can, in fact, figure out, where did this guy get his information from? Did he pull it from here or there? Where did I get it from? And can I go look it up myself, look at the same pieces of evidence, and be able to come to a similar interpretation as a result? That's the way we verify historical research, by the way. It's the way you verify any research. The notes, where did they get the stuff from to do what they did, or say what they say, and interpret what they interpreted. And so anything that is based primarily on primary sources can be a secondary source. And by the way, anything that is based primarily on secondary sources can also be a secondary source if the person who's doing the citing of those secondary sources is also themselves an expert in the field and has expertise that can easily lead them to find the same primary sources and interpret them. That's a little wrinkle there. It's a little bit more complicated than saying, that's a little bit more complicated. A tertiary source is the third level, and that's the level of sourcing where, where what you're dealing with is someone that not just cites secondary sources, but is itself sort of a summary of secondary sources. There's no new interpretation there. The person's not providing expertise in a way that provides new interpretations, looking at new ways of looking at the same evidence or anything like that. It is literally the recording of secondary sources in some sort of summarized or synthesized form. And that makes it a tertiary resource or source. And that would be encyclopedias, online, and you know, actually series of encyclopedia books. That would be dictionaries, dictionary definitions of stuff. For instance, that's a tertiary source. Textbooks, standard textbook for any classroom is usually a tertiary source, even if it's written by somebody who's actually done primary research, because they're synthesizing research. They're not saying anything particularly new about that stuff. So that makes it a tertiary source. And your assignment for week 3 is essentially to figure out this and get this right, right? It's actually fairly simple. The wrinkle that I introduced about secondary, people using secondary sources primarily to write what would be a secondary source manuscript is an interesting wrinkle, but I don't think the things that you're dealing with for the course actually get into that wrinkle at all. So don't worry about that too much. So that's one thing. On the issue of opinion, fact, and interpretation, I've been talking about this in UMC for quite some time in other contexts and other courses. In fact, I have a couple of videos that deal with the issue of facts versus opinions versus interpretations that I've done for my lower level history courses in U.S. World and African American history at UMUC over the last probably a video that's about anywhere between 3 and 5 years old. So you can look at that for more detail, but I will summarize it for you as well. And in fact, you can look at it in more detail through my blog site, which is www.donaldearlcollins.com. And there's a section that's called videos, and those videos are for UMUC students, so you can look facts, opinions, and interpretations up, where I go through 15 minutes of talking about the differences between those three. But I will sum it up in this way. Personal opinion, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not only are you not entitled to your own facts, your opinion, not all opinions are equal. An interpretation is an opinion based on expertise and evidence, right? It might be, you can say it's just an opinion all you want, but if someone who's giving that opinion has been doing research in that field or subfield or area of expertise for, say, 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, whatever, it's not just an opinion. That would be like saying that a 5-year-old's opinion about what the meaning of life is more profound than someone who's been writing on the topic for 30 years and happens to be 50 years old, right? You wouldn't take that 50-year-old's opinion and just dump it in the trash or say that it's the equivalent of what a 5-year-old says, no matter how profound the thoughts of a 5-year-old can be. And sometimes it can be very profound. I know this firsthand. I have a son. But that doesn't mean that I would completely replace what a 50-year-old who's done expertise on the meaning of life over what he has to say. And how you get from opinion to interpretation is based on facts. It's based on evidence. It's based on looking at and poring over records. Or if you happen to be doing American Studies research and your research happens to involve the recordings of music or recordings of movies and TV shows, and it happens to be on a particular topic, being able to be grounded, or if it's crunching numbers and looking at census data dating back 100 years, or it's crunching the numbers based on U.S. Department of Education reports around test results going back 20, 25 years for the NAEP exam, or maybe even 30 years. That's all, that's the evidence. Those are the facts that people need in their different fields in order to make proper interpretations, or at least logical interpretations, based on that variety of evidence and and that variety and those varieties of facts, right? When people say you're not entitled to your own facts, all that simply means is that your opinion is literally based on who you are. What your parents told you when you're growing up, or the things that you've absorbed out of your life and out of your personal life, good and bad, whether it's around the isms that exist in our society: racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Muslim feelings, et cetera, or what even positive stuff around social justice and anti-racism. There might be some stuff mixed in there that involves some bias, maybe not as much as obviously somebody who wants to who believes themselves to be superior over other people, but that's another story, right? Bottom line is that when you start talking about the issue of opinion, opinion, in order to get to interpretation, you have to go through a process. You have to go through a process where you understand that you're approaching this, how you approach whatever topic you're researching from a methodological or epistemological standpoint, meaning that it's based on something, right? If you are a critical race theorist, you understand, you have a way of looking at the research that allows you to interpret it a certain way, right? It's not just your opinion about the notions of race in American society, for instance, or if you happen to be doing research around, say, the Turner thesis and looking at the U.S. Turner's thesis it had a frame to it, and that frame allowed him to look at the U.S. and the formation of the U.S. from sea to shining sea across North America over the course of 100 or 120 years from a certain standpoint. He didn't just have an opinion per se and then just try to find stuff to weigh his opinion, although some people would argue that he did, right? But either way, there's some method to the madness, in other words. And what we're hoping to do with this course, actually what historians hope to do with every course they teach regarding students, is to move you away from the I feel, I think, I believe kinds of statements to the evidence supports blah, 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 and blah, 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 right? The evidence suggests blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. It ain't just about what you feel, right? And quite frankly, it isn't really about you at all, right? Students have this tendency to think that the materials that they're covering, the issues that they're dealing with, are really about them and try to make it personal. And while certainly the research that you do, especially if it's more relatively recent historical research, or especially if it's something that's related to maybe your ancestry or something along those lines, it might cause you to think about how it relates to you in some way. We're human beings, of course we're going to do that. But from the standpoint of being a history student or historian, that you kind of have to in this case you do put that aside, or acknowledge it in some sort of way in order to do better research, in order to see where the research, where the evidence, where the facts take you, right? So you're being a detective, and in the process of being that detective, you find that this interpretation doesn't work for you, but this historical methodology does work for you, that sort of thing. And so we're trying to move you toward interpretation, right? You're not going to get there in 8 weeks, but it's a start anyway. And then the third thing is around some of the readings that you have for this week, around oral histories, around the Turner thesis, and so on. It's sort of disjointed the way we had, it's not like I put this reading list together, the way the powers that be at UMUC have put this reading list together, because some of the stuff that you'll read later on in the course relates directly to week 2. The Turner thesis, for instance, is one that has become sort of passé and largely debunked by most historians of environmental history and the history of the U.S. West and the history of Native Americans, and quite frankly the history of African Americans in the context of how the West was won. Turner thesis is simply this, that the U.S. expanded its way to becoming a continental country of borders on 2 oceans and plus Alaska and Hawaii and eventually territories, on the basis of seeing this vast, pristine, underpopulated or unpopulated wilderness from which to draw resources to make this land great and wonderful, economically, militarily, democratically, and so on and so forth. Neglecting the fact that millions of Native Americans lived on this land, neglecting the fact that over the course of settlers spreading their way from sea to shining sea, they kicked out Mexicans and actually took over basically a third, 40% of Mexico during the Mexican-American War, right? That they kind of eradicated or almost wiped out Native American groups throughout west of the Mississippi between roughly 1850 and 1890, 1890, 1900 or so. They completely almost wiped out the buffalo in the process of doing so in order to quote unquote pacify Native Americans. So this story of this pristine, vast wilderness, the Turner thesis, as it was called, after he wrote his famous book about this in 1893, has been mostly debunked by people like William Cronin, who you will read in week 7 or 8. I think it's week 8, and other folks over the course of doing what we call historiography. And by the way, just as a quick aside, and I'll talk about this again to reinforce it, what historiography is, technically speaking, it would be the science of history, but what it really is the study of how historians have put together interpretations on a particular topic or set of interrelated topics over time. Meaning that in the case of the Turner thesis, Turner's the first to really look at the conception of America as basically being a civilizing force to a vast, pristine, savage wilderness, right? That's the sort of interpretation. And that the West, the wilderness part of the U.S. was essentially done in 1890 when there was more than one white man per square mile west of the Mississippi. When that happened, the West was won, essentially. By the way, think about the arrogance of that, just as an aside, to think that if there's one white man per square mile west of the Mississippi, that the wilderness, the West, is no longer the West anymore. It's no longer wild as a result. The end, civilizations, Western civilizations made it across the North America, case closed. You know, it's incredibly insulting and demeaning toward all the other people who live in this part of the world prior to 1890, right? Not to mention people who are living there who happen to not be white and male. But so that's the side. But that's the Turner thesis in a nutshell, and it's the main thesis really until you get to the 1970s and 80s when Native American studies becomes more prominent and more people are saying this is extremely racist. This thesis completely negates the contributions of whole groups of people who were exploited, who were killed, in order for settlers to essentially colonize or civilize lands the rest of the Mississippi. And so that's kind of what we're getting at. This is this introduction of first thoughts in terms of the historiography regarding the Turner thesis. Oral histories also are interesting, and then I'll stop with that, because historians didn't always accept oral histories, oral interviews as actual historical evidence. They didn't always do that. Until really the late 70s and early 80s, lots of professors, lots of people in the field kind of saw this as a fad, but not something that would actually take hold within the field, because they didn't see, because the written word was the only thing that we were supposed to count as accurate, right? People's historical accounts through the spoken word, well, that's not really that accurate, which has been proven over and over and over again over the last 40 years to be wrong. Now, some of you in discussion last week tried to make that same argument, but the reality is that every professional historian worth anything in the field, including yours truly, sees oral interviews as a very rich resource to mine for historical accuracy, for being able to form a more complete and robust picture of events that have happened over time, right? Whether you're talking about migration or slavery studies or workers' rights or Native American experiences or folklore or whatever, you need those stories as part of a rich group of primary resources. So so part of what I'm saying is the field itself has had to evolve over time in order to accept not only more interpretations, but better ways of getting at those interpretations and better ways of having that level of accuracy that we and integrity and fairness that we need within the field in order to have a complete picture or a better picture of things that have happened over time. And so that's all I'm leaving you with this week as food for thought.